Hi, thanks for joining us for another continuing study in the book of 1 Samuel. I'm Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas, and today we're going to be taking a look at chapters 4 and 5 of 1 Samuel, in which the ark was captured by the enemy of the Israelites, the Philistines. Now, we've already seen in previous chapters how God had raised up Samuel to be a new leader, the kind of leader that maybe if the people didn't want, they needed. And so far the story has concentrated mostly on Samuel. But now he's been firmly selected as the leader of God's people. And now the story is going to focus for a while on the Ark of the Covenant, that famous gold-gilded box that was created in order to be placed in the holiest part of the tabernacle before the temple was built. And contained the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Now, the ark was a silent but a important, powerful symbol of God's presence, and the people placed great stock in it, as we're going to see later on. But using it for the purpose that they did really reinforces the idea that they really didn't understand it. They didn't understand the purpose of the ark itself, and they let their misconception take the focus off of the God that it represented. So let's begin by reading the first few verses of 1 Samuel chapter 4. In 1 Samuel 4, beginning in verse 1, it says, "Thus the word of Samuel came to all Israel." Now we'll stop there for just a minute before we get too much further on. But it seems that this first sentence actually seems to fit better with the very end of verse 21 of chapter 3. We're told in verse 21 that the Lord appeared to Samuel by the word of the Lord. And so we understand that the word of Samuel is actually the word of God, and it was firmly established. It says, "Now Israel went out to meet the Philistines in battle and camped beside Ebenezer, while the Philistines camped in Aphek. The Philistines drew up in battle array to meet Israel. And when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the battlefield. And when the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, 'Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies.'" We'll stop there. We've seen that the word of God is established through Samuel, but the people aren't established. And we can anticipate the coming defeat that we read about because it demonstrates Israel's inability to lift themselves out of a situation of their own making. Politically, they were at the mercy of the Philistines. Morally, the people were corrupt and at the mercy of their own vices. That was exemplified by the corruption of the priesthood, of the priests themselves. And so battling their archenemy, the Philistines, would have given them an opportunity to rely on God instead of themselves. And in the past, he'd given them victory for doing just that. But this time was different. We read that 4,000 Israelites were killed. That's a massive casualty count. But I want you to notice something. Notice that it was the elders of Israel who said, "Let's take the Ark of the Covenant." Now they said, "Why has Yahweh defeated us?" Now they didn't say the Lord, they said his name Yahweh, because they knew that it was the God of heaven himself who had allowed this to happen. And so they're thinking there must be something that we can do. And their first thought is to introduce the Ark of the Covenant into battle. And again, we just see the ineptitude of Israel's leadership, and it reinforces the need for new leadership. They should have known that God wouldn't be with them as long as they tolerated the sins of Eli's sons. And historically, good leadership in Israel would be very erratic and sporadic, until God, through the prophet Ezekiel, foretold of a time when he would anoint his own leader. He would appoint a shepherd over the sheep his people Israel. In fact, let's just take a quick look at Ezekiel chapter 34. Ezekiel chapter 34. This is about 400 or so years after the things that we're reading about in Ezekiel. I'm sorry, in 1 Samuel chapter 4. But I want you to notice with me in verse 1 of Ezekiel 34 says, "The word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to the shepherds, Thus says the Lord God, Woe, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flock?" Remember, we read about that very thing going on back in 1 Samuel. The priests Hophni and Phinehas were having their representatives stick the fork in the pot that was boiling the sacrifice, and it would bring up whatever it would bring up, and they would seize on that, in spite of the fact that sometimes it would be the portion that was supposed to go to God. We continue reading in Ezekiel 34. Verse 3 says, "You eat the fat and clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fat sheep without feeding the flock." In verse 10, "Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against the shepherds, and I will demand my sheep from them and make them cease from feeding my sheep. So that the shepherds will not feed themselves anymore, but I will deliver my flock from their mouth, so that they will not be food for them." Look over verse 23 of Ezekiel 34. "Then I will set over them one shepherd, my servant David, and he will feed them, and he will feed them himself and be their shepherd. And I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, Yahweh, have spoken." Well, God is going to be very patient with them throughout the ages as he puts up with the ineptitude of their leadership. But God foretells a time that he's going to be done with it. He's going to be tired of it. Well, back in 1 Samuel chapter 4, we see where the ark is introduced into the fray. Read with me as we continue in verse 4. "So the people sent to Shiloh, and from there they carried the ark of the covenant from the Lord of hosts, who sits above the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, and all Israel shouted with a great shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shout, they said, What does the noise of this great shout in the camp of the Hebrews mean? Then they understood that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp. The Philistines were afraid, for they said, God has come into the camp. And they said, Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us! Who shall deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, or you will become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been slaves to you before. Therefore, as they have been slaves to you, therefore, be men and fight." The Israelites must have been thinking that since this worked at Jericho, remember back when they first entered the land generations before, God had them carry the ark around the walled city of Jericho, and they delivered that great shout, and the walls fell. Well, they figured it must work again. If it worked for us before, it's got to work again. But consider what they're doing. They're thinking of the ark as a talisman, as a lucky or a magic charm. They think that they can somehow manipulate God into doing what they want by carrying this holy box into battle. Now remember, inside the ark were the tablets of the covenant, the very covenant that they were breaking. And not only that, they failed to think about their own sins. Did you see that Hophni and Phinehas have joined the fray here? They're the ones who are the reason for God's displeasure among the people. The fact that they didn't even think about their own sins is evidenced by the fact that Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the ark. And what do we find happened? Israel is defeated again. This time the rout is worse. 30,000 Israelites killed. Look at verse 10. "So the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and every man fled to his tent, and the slaughter was very great. For there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was taken, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. So not only was the slaughter great, but the ark itself was taken. Can you imagine what must have been going through the Israelites' mind? They thought for sure that this was their lucky charm, that God was somehow going to be manipulated as long as they carried this with them, that his presence would be with them, that his approval would be with them. And instead of that happening, the rout that they suffered was worse and far more bloody. And to top it off, the ark is taken into captivity. Oh, after Israel's defeats, we see Israel's despair. In verses 12 through 18, we're told of the death of Eli. Let's read it. Now a man of Benjamin came from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day with his clothes torn and dust on his head. And when he came, behold, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road, eagerly watching, because his heart was trembling from the ark of God. For the man came to tell it in the city, and all the city cried out. When Eli heard the noise of the outcry, he said, What does the noise of this commotion mean? And then the man came hurriedly and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old, and his eyes were set so that he could not see. The man said to Eli, I am the one who came from the battle line. Indeed, I escaped from the battle line today. And he said, How did things go, my son? Now the one who brought the news replied, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people. And your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been taken. And when he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell off the seat backward beside the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died, for he was old and heavy. Thus he judged Israel 40 years. So Eli is 98 years old. Probably not in the best of health, but it wasn't his age that killed him. When he heard the news of his sons, he must have realized the confirmation of the prophecy that he'd already heard at least twice. But he couldn't have been prepared for the news of the ark. He was expecting that his sons were eventually going to die and die together on the same day. Maybe he thought that because this battle was so momentous that maybe this was the one in which they would be killed. But when he heard mentioned that the ark was taken, it just hit him, the significance of this moment. First, it signifies the end of the Eli dynasty. Eli's fall from his chair literally was the dethronement of the priesthood of him and his descendants. Second, Eli's death signaled the end of the abomination that was Israel's corruption, that rivaled even that of pagan idolatry. We saw that idolatry was rampant in the book of Judges. This is still in that time. And then we see where it says, thus, in the end of verse 18, he judged Israel for 40 years. And what a terrible judgeship he performed. God's displeasure upon his people was great. And he wasn't the only one that understood that. We read about his daughter-in-law in the following verses. In verse 19 it says, Now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas's wife, was pregnant and about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was taken and that her father-in-law and her husband had died, she kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the women who stood by her said to her, Do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son. But she did not answer or pay attention. She called the boy Ichabod, saying, The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken and because of her father-in-law and her husband. She said, The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken. The words spoken against the house of Eli were certain. Every promise, just as God said from beginning to end, was coming to pass. And Eli's nameless daughter, all we know, his daughter-in-law, all we know is that she's the wife of Phinehas, which makes the things he was doing with the women who attended the tabernacle all the more appalling. she's so overcome by the succession of bad news that she goes into labor. And in spite of the attending women's encouraging remarks to her, their attempts to help her, to succor her, to comfort her, she realized the enormity of the events in the naming of her son. She named him Ichabod, which means no glory, because the glory had departed from Israel, because the ark of the Lord was gone. This was certainly the end of an era. Eli's family didn't completely die out. Later on in chapter 14, we read about his grandsons. But they never really served in any significant part of the nation's leadership. We've been reading about Shiloh and about the great battle that had occurred with the huge amount of Israelite casualties. Go with me for a moment to Psalm 78. Psalm 78. Psalm 78, we're going to begin reading in verse 60. Psalm 78, beginning in verse 60, indicates that Shiloh was destroyed by the Philistines in this very battle. In Psalm 78, beginning in verse 60, actually, let's begin in verse 59. When God heard, he was filled with wrath and greatly abhorred Israel, so that he abandoned the dwelling place at Shiloh, the tent which he had pitched among men, and he gave up his strength to captivity and his glory into the hand of the adversary. He also delivered his people to the sword and was filled with wrath at his inheritance. Fire devoured his young men, and his virgins had no wedding songs. His priests fell by the sword, and his widows could not weep. What else could this be talking about but this battle that we're reading about? The ark never returned to Shiloh. And we'll read about that actually in our next lesson. But Shiloh never had any significance as a theological or even a political center for Israel anymore. Indeed, Jeremiah, when you go with me to Jeremiah chapter 7, go there with me, Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah uses Shiloh as a deliberate example of the setting aside of God of something that he had previously used and blessed, but no longer considered. In Jeremiah 7, look with me in Jeremiah 7, beginning in verse 12. Through the prophet God says, "But now go to my place, which was in Shiloh, where I made my name dwell at the first, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people Israel. And now because you have done all these things, declares the Lord, and I spoke to you, rising up early and speaking, but you did not hear, but I called you, but you did not answer. Therefore I will do to the house which is called by my name, in which you trust, and go to the place which I gave you and your fathers, as I did to Shiloh. I will cast you out of my sight as I cast out all your brothers and the offspring of Ephraim." Now God is predicting the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of his temple. And he's saying all this is going to happen just like it happened back in Shiloh. So the idea that we get of this battle going on in Shiloh is not just the enormous casualty, it's the fall of the place that the people had considered at that time to be the center of all that they held dear religiously. Israel in 1 Samuel 4 is again at a new low. They fail to consider that God desired them to turn back to him. Just as Moses had foretold in the book of Deuteronomy, he reminded them again and again and again of the dangers they would face in that new land and how they needed to be diligent about it. Let's go back to 1 Samuel. We finished chapter 4, and it ends, of course, on a very low note. Now we're going to read about the ark and the adventures of the people that mishandled it as it was in captivity. First, let's read about the ark in Ashdod and the danger that that ark posed to their god Dagon. Beginning in verse 1 of chapter 5 of 1 Samuel, it says, "Now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. When the Ashdodites arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and set him in his place again. Now we'll stop there for just a moment. Ashdod is about 25 miles or so southwest of Ebenezer, where the battle was waged, and they had taken their prize, probably marched it triumphantly through the city, and placed it in the temple of their god. This temple, the temple of Dagon, was a tribute to the God that they certainly right now absolutely believed was superior to Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. Dagon was thought to be sort of a fish man or a man-fish god. But for them it was fitting that Yahweh's box, this symbol of who he was, should serve as an attendant in Dagon's house. And that's the whole point of this. They set it before him to serve Dagon. But God certainly upset that belief. The next morning they come in and they find that Dagon's image is found with his face down towards the box. Dagon is in a position of reverence and in a posture of submission to the ark. And certainly that was no accident. They set him back up. Go read with me in 1 Samuel chapter 5 some more. In verse 5, in verse 4, after verse 3 tells us that they set him in his place again, it says, when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord again. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor all who enter Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Now the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he ravaged them and smote them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territories. And when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is severe on us and on Dagon our God. So they sent and gathered all the lords of the Philistines and said to them, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? And they said, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. And they brought the ark of the God of Israel around. Now, notice what's going on. At first, the ark of God is placed before their image of Dagon to serve Dagon. But what happened? Dagon fell on his face before the ark, right? This position or posture of submission, right? Well, it must have been a fluke, they thought. They set him up again. And the next day they come in and they find that not only is he in the same posture, but his head and his hands have been cut off. Now that's significant. It's a manner that's reminiscent of what conquering kings did to their enemies. We see that throughout the book of both books of Samuel, in 1 Samuel 17 and 1 Samuel 31 and 2 Samuel chapter 4. We see where conquering kings cut off either the head or the hands, or sometimes both, of their enemies. Think about what's going on here. The Philistines' conquering divine hero had been humbled and then mercilessly executed in his own stronghold. Now, the Israelites, or rather the Philistines, were unaware, or were very aware, in fact, of the plagues that God had brought against Egypt. If we go back to chapter 4, we read in verse 8 where they said, woe to us, who will deliver us from the hand of these mighty gods? These are the gods who smote the Egyptians with all kinds of plagues in the wilderness. Even some 400 years later, they're still remembering, or they're still thinking about the work that God did and the plagues that he brought upon the Egyptians way back when. But now they themselves would experience versions of that plague. And like the plagues of Egypt, it told us in the book of Exodus that these were against all the gods of Egypt. Well, now God is exercising his will against the God of the Philistines. And he not only does that, but he brings disease and death to the oppressor of the Hebrews, these painful tumors. I want you to see that these are attributed to the hand of God. Several times his heavy hand is mentioned. Here in verse 6 it says, "Now the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he ravaged them." In verse 7 they say, "His hand is severe on us and on Dagon, our God." In verse 9, we haven't read there yet, but it says, "The hand of the Lord was against the city with very great confusion." In verse 11, it says, "Send away the ark of the God of Israel. Let it return to its own place, so that it will not kill us and our people. For there was a deadly confusion throughout the city, and the hand of God was very heavy there." That's talking about Ekron, and we'll talk about Ekron here in just a moment. The idea is that God is active and working against those who dishonored him. I want you to see something. There's some irony going on here. Dagon's hands were cut off, right? He was helpless. But God's hand is heavy and active against his and his people's enemies. Well, we saw at the end of verse 8 where they decide that they're going to send the ark on to Gath. And see what occurs there in verse 9. "After they had brought it around to Gath, the hand of the Lord was against that city with very great confusion, and he smote the men of the city, both young and old, so that the tumors broke out on them." Now, one thing we haven't mentioned here is that because of the wording in the King James Version, it's thought that these tumors were of a very delicate and personal nature. It's thought that perhaps they could have been a severe outbreak of hemorrhoids. And if they were, that means that God is willing to smite them in the most personal way. I want you to see what's going on here. Whatever the reason for moving the ark to Gath, it only increased the judgments. They didn't move it very far, but about maybe 10 or so miles, hoping that it would be far enough to get the curse away from Ashdod. But all it did was continue bringing forth onslaughts against the Philistine people in two ways. First, in an emotional sense, they were confused, and in a physical sense, they had these painful outbursts of tumors that occurred on them. And what do? Well, in turn, they send it on to Ekron. Let's continue reading. In verse 10 it says, "So they sent the ark of God to Ekron." Now, Ekron is about 3 or 4 miles north of Gath. And again, probably the idea is to get it out of here, and if the ark goes, hopefully the pestilence and the curse and the trouble that we're dealing with goes with it. As we continue reading, let's just continue reading in verse 10 again. "They sent the ark of God to Ekron, and as the ark of God came to Ekron, the Ekronites cried out, saying, 'They brought the ark of the God of Israel around to us, to kill us and our people.'" They've already heard about what it had been doing to previous Philistine cities. "They sent, therefore, and gathered all the lords of the Philistines, and said, 'Send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it return to its own place, so that it will not kill us and our people. For there was a deadly confusion throughout the city. The hand of God was very heavy there, and the men who did not die were smitten with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven.'" Well, of course, by then, as we said before, the news of the ark's presence and the pestilence that accompanied it had spread to Ekron. It filled them with fear. Why are they doing this? Why are they sending it here? They want to know, creating even more distress. And the confusion continued, but notice how now it's called deadly confusion. The end of this chapter leaves a very sad scene for the Philistines. Confusion, pestilence, and death for those who treated God and his representative ark with such contempt. And so the Philistines learn a hard lesson. And it's the lesson that the Israelites themselves needed to learn in chapter 4. Nobody can manipulate or control God simply by obtaining some relic that's attributed to him. He is sovereign and free, and although we read before that he is enthroned between the cherubim, who he is can never be reduced to a tiny spot above a piece of furniture. He's not chained to his throne. God is omnipotent. He is omnipresent. He is wherever he wants to be to do whatever he wants to do. God was simply bigger than the Philistine, or even for that matter, the Israelite theological constructs of who they thought he was. They both grossly underestimated God's power and especially his holiness. And so while the nation of Israel failed and their priesthood failed and the very ark of God seemed to fail, God himself gloriously vindicated himself, even in the midst of his own enemies. And that's a lesson for us as well. Sometimes we underestimate the power and the might and the holiness of God. And so the lessons that the Israelites needed to learn, that the Philistines learned the hard way, well, they're ours to learn as well. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at chapters 6 and 7 concerning the return of the ark to Israel. And hope you'll join us for that study. Thanks. God bless.